James felt a chill run through him. The fight had just escalated. Rick wasn't just a foreman. He was part of something bigger, something James wasn't prepared for. Mark hesitated, his face pale. "I didn't want to get involved, but I think they're watching us right now." Suddenly, the door swung open, and a figure stepped inside. James's heart skipped a beat. It was Rick. And he wasn't alone. The foreman locked eyes with James, his smug expression sending a wave of dread through him. Something was about to happen, and James wasn't sure he was ready for it. James felt his throat tighten as Rick and his men approached the booth. The air grew thick with tension, and Mark's face turned an unnatural shade of pale. Rick didn't say a word as he slid into the booth beside James, his eyes cold and calculating. The weight of the moment pressed down on James, but he refused to back down. "So, you think you can take me down, huh?" Rick's voice was low, almost a growl. "You think you've got the guts to expose me?" James took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I don't just think it. I know it. You've been getting away with this for too long, Rick, and I'm not going to let you do it to anyone else." There was a brief, tense silence. Then Rick's lips curled into a smirk. "You're naive. You really think you can stand up to me?" Before James could respond, Mark suddenly stood up, knocking over his drink. "I've seen enough." His voice cracked. "I'm done covering for you, Rick." Rick's face twisted in anger, but before he could react, Mark continued. "James isn't the only one you've been controlling. I've been complicit in your schemes, but I can't do it anymore. The truth is, you're not untouchable. You're just a coward hiding behind your connections." The room went deathly quiet. Rick's expression faltered for a moment, and James seized the opportunity. "We've got everything. Photos, recordings, witness statements. You can't silence us anymore." For a moment, Rick just stared, his facade cracking. But then his demeanor shifted. A cold smile spread across his face. "You think it's that easy? I've got people who'll make sure your little plan falls apart before it even starts." But then, just as quickly, a sudden noise cut through the tension. Someone barged through the door, and James froze. It was the police. They'd been following Rick's trail for months, and Mark had secretly tipped them off. Rick's face drained of color as officers moved in to arrest him, reading his rights. In the chaos, just as Rick was being cuffed, he glanced back at James with an expression that could only be described as a promise of retaliation. But just before the door slammed shut, there was one final twist. Mark's face darkened. "James, I didn't tell you everything," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "The police, they're not here for just Rick. They're after me too. I've been working with them, but there's more to this than you realize. You've only scratched the surface." As the officers hauled Rick and Mark away, James was left standing in the middle of the room, caught between victory and an unsettling truth. The fight was far from over. James stood there, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. The police had left, and the bar was eerily quiet, but his mind was racing. Mark's confession was still fresh in his ears. He had been complicit, but there were bigger forces at play. As much as he'd wanted this to be the end, James realized it wasn't. The corruption ran deeper than he could have imagined. But at least for now, Rick was behind bars. James had exposed the man who had caused him so much pain, and that alone felt like a small victory. His fight wasn't over, though. He would need to stay vigilant to make sure the truth continued to come out. As James walked out into the cool night air, he couldn't help but reflect on everything he'd learned. Sometimes the hardest battles were the ones that forced you to confront not just the enemy, but the system that enabled them. And that fight, James knew, was just beginning. The sun beat down on the construction site as James wiped the sweat from his forehead. He had been working hard all morning, just like every other day. But today felt different. His foreman, Rick, had been pushing him harder than usual, barking orders and making him take on the most dangerous tasks. James hesitated when Rick told him to climb a shaky scaffold without proper safety gear, but he needed the job. He had a family to support. Then it happened. A misstep, a sudden slip, and James found himself crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his body as his co-workers rushed to his side. Instead of concern, Rick was furious. Hours later, James was told he was fired. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a lawsuit arrived, blaming him for the accident. How could this happen? And what would he do next? James lay in the hospital bed, the pain from the fall throbbing in his back and legs. His mind raced, trying to piece together what went wrong. He had followed Rick's orders, just like he always did. But this time, something didn't sit right. Rick had always been tough on him, pushing him to go beyond his limits, but now it felt like the pressure had gone too far. He remembered the smirk Rick had given him before the accident, almost as if he knew something James didn't. The news of the lawsuit hit James like a punch to the gut. He was being accused of negligence, even though he'd been working under Rick's direct supervision. No one at the site seemed to be on his side, and the company's lawyers were quick to distance themselves. It was a fight he couldn't win alone, but who could he turn to? Everyone was afraid of crossing the foreman. James spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out his next move. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rick had orchestrated the whole thing, pushing him into dangerous situations, knowing he'd be too scared to say no. The foreman's cold demeanor after the accident only confirmed his suspicions, and yet everyone at the site seemed too afraid to speak out. His co-workers were mostly silent, avoiding eye contact when he passed them. Some of them whispered behind his back, but none of them would stand up for him. Mark, one of the more experienced workers, had seemed like a friend, but even he kept his distance. James couldn't help but wonder, was Rick's influence that powerful? Had he manipulated everyone into believing James was at fault? Desperation began to creep in. James couldn't just let Rick win. But with the company turning its back on him and no one willing to speak up, where could he find support? Maybe it was time to dig into Rick's past, to find out if anyone else had suffered in silence. James spent every free moment digging into Rick's history. He visited old job sites, asking quiet questions, piecing together a darker picture of the foreman. Workers from previous jobs spoke in hushed tones, afraid to talk too openly. But little by little, James learned that Rick had a reputation for pushing his team too hard, sometimes to the point of injury. He had gotten away with it before, sweeping accidents under the rug, burying the truth with threats and intimidation. James's heart raced as he connected the dots. This wasn't just about one accident, it was about a pattern. He wasn't the first person Rick had hurt, but he might be the first to fight back. The thought of confronting Rick made his stomach churn. But if he didn't stand up now, the same thing could happen to someone else. Late one evening, as James sat in his small apartment, his phone buzzed. A message from Mark popped up. "Meet me at the bar. I have something important to show you." James hesitated. Could this be the break he'd been looking for? Or was it just another attempt to keep him quiet? The tension was unbearable as he grabbed his coat and headed out. James's footsteps echoed through the quiet streets as he walked toward the bar. The weight of the unknown gnawed at him, making his pulse quicken. What could Mark possibly have for him? Was it a way to take down Rick, or was he just another part of the system trying to shut him up? As he entered the dimly lit bar, he spotted Mark sitting in a corner booth, looking around nervously. James sat down across from him, his eyes scanning the room. Mark leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're right about Rick, but there's something you need to know. Something I didn't realize until it was too late." He paused, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. "Rick has connections, powerful ones. You're not just fighting him. He's got ties to people who can bury your case before it even sees the courtroom."